Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast in which I, your host Tylor, know a lot about the Wheel of Time and say the intro exactly the same every time. And I am joined by Greg, who thinks that I need to loosen up and say other things in the intro and maybe talk like I'm on NPR. Greg, how are you feeling about our position in these books? Because I know how you feel about my intros.
I do think I can tell how much you like the chapters by how fast the tempo of your intro is. That's all that changes. Like, are you interested in getting to them quickly, or do you not really care? Dear listeners, last week was definitely, even though it was my intro, it was definitely a we don't really care. We'll fill in an hour, but I think we have more to talk about this week, and I have some good questions, I think, because these were exciting chapters and, a new POV, right? First time POV?
Yeah.
Yeah. We continue to just claw our way through this book. I am actively hunting down the next book because, as I think I said in the middle of book 4, these are getting harder just to be guaranteed to be sitting in a bookstore now. So I am looking for book 6 to prepare for February probably, but we're getting there.
In some editions, that book does look shorter because I think some of the end material is shorter, but if you are looking for it, just look for the giant multiple brick-sized novel. It is the thickest of the Wheel of Time books, so be prepared for Lord of Chaos. I think the fact that we are talking about books that will come in, 30-something chapters is probably an indication that we are ready for Chapter 19, Memories, which, yes, Greg is correct, I am excited to get to, because then I can get done with this summary that will probably take me 20 minutes. In Memories, Morgase is roused from a stupor by Talonvor, and she thinks about how she has been reading, but it has been an hour since the last time she turned the page. He seems surprised that she hasn't responded in any meaningful way to the morning's news, and she is surprised to remember that she doesn't know what the morning's news is, and also that she has seemingly been very friendly with Altiema as she is now thinking about it, despite the fact that she is very clearly flirting with what Morgase thinks of as her man. Talonvor says that the news is rebellion in the Two Rivers, and she worries about this, and then is told that Gabriel laughed it off when he heard about it, and she immediately rushes off towards Gabriel, who, when she finds him, is surrounded by a number of women. Many of them were her rivals in the succession. Morgase then demands to speak with him in private, but he brushes her off, and she then demands to speak now, seemingly shouting at him, but he orders her to basically go rest and go back to her rooms, and she mindlessly does so and doesn't even realize what she is doing until she has arrived in her room. It then takes a significant amount of effort for her to leave, and she thinks that Gabriel knows how insulting it was to invite all of her enemies, and he must have been doing it in a calculated way. She realizes bitterly how much she has been doing exactly what he wants and how much she has been blind to what has been going on, and then she suddenly realizes that she is going to the housing of Lini, her former nurse, and what I wrote in my notes is Elayne's quote factory. She sees a number of portraits of herself and others in her family, and thinks of all of the time that she has spent with Lini and all of the time that she spent in the White Tower. She remembers the difficulty of winning the throne, and she thinks that is not wise to give it up even briefly. And then Lini arrives and chides her for her abrupt arrival, and Morgase says that she is the queen, but Lini says, well, basically, I'm going to yell at you anyways. You can kill me if you want to, and I thought that was pretty baller. Morgase says she visits weekly, but Lini says that she hasn't seen her since spring, and then Lini asks if there is a problem with Gabriel, and when Morgase is surprised to see she knows, Lini says everyone knows. Morgase doesn't even seem to know the full extent of it, because it turns out there are many other women in the picture, and Morgase is furious, but then seemingly doesn't remember exiling all of her allies when she starts to think about who could help her. Lini thinks she must be sick, but Morgase doesn't want an Aes Sedai investigating her, even as she thinks of how proud she is of Elayne. At this point, she sends a very suspicious Lini to find guardsman Talonvor, and while Lini is gone, Morgase struggles to resist the urge to go back to Gabriel, and then she thinks of her marriage of convenience with Tarangale Damodred, and then her affair with Tom, and then her time with Gareth Brine, who she still seemingly hates, before thinking about Gabriel. Talonvor arrives and apparently was basically threatened by Lini, and Morgase refers to him as a boy, and he is very angry about this. She asks how many loyal men there are left in the guard, and he says just him, but the rest are loyal to Gabriel. Talonvor crafts a plan to have them meet unseen the Queen's blessing, insisting that Basil Gill is as loyal to her as he is. He demands to know why she waited so long, but she gives a non-answer and he leaves. Lini then asks why Morgase calls him young so often, and as I put it in my notes, Lini ships the two of them. Lini talks about Talonvor and the fact that he, after swearing the oaths to Gabriel, swore his oaths again to Morgase in the old way where he cut his arm. Morgase then says she is going to disguise herself, and she does so, and as she walks through town, she both hears how much she looks like the queen and also how negatively the average person thinks about the queen at this point. She also notes that Lini is barely keeping up, and then Lini says she intends to tend to Elayne's babies, and I thought that was hilarious. Basil Gill is there at his inn, and he has a sword, even though he says he hasn't used one since the Aiel War, and he has also brought along Lamgwin and Brienne. I don't know how we're going to pronounce that, Brianna, maybe, and she tries to convince, and Morgase tries to convince Brienne to stay, but she refuses to do so. Morgase thinks of her small army and how it is inadequate. And then when she says they need to gather more, Talonvor says they need to go to Gareth Brine. She stifles an argument, and they head off to where they think Gareth Brine is, but we know he has left. We then switch into Padden Fane's point of view, and he thinks that he can sense Randall Thor, and that was a gift from the Dark One when he was taken into Shaiel Ghul. He thinks that he has now been reborn since he was in Arid Hall, and he picks a lock to get into a door in the tower, and then he opens a box that is drawing him, and he finds the dagger that once possessed Matt. He then, as he turns around, sees a girl who is apparently watching the door and stabs her. As he dies, he steps outside and sees another Aes Sedai, Elvieren, who we recognize as being the second to Elida. She tells him that there was a ward and that the girl should have summoned guards, and he says that she is a Black Aja, and after she dances around it for a little bit, she eventually more or less concedes that, and then she realizes that he has been to Shaiel Ghul and decides to let him go, much to Padden Fane's delight, as he now thinks he is complete. Boy, did I forget that there was a Padden Fane section of this chapter, so I was very confused by the chapter icon for most of this chapter. What did you think of Memories? And the only request I have is that you not sing in any way that resembles a cat.
I also thought, I mean, one of my main questions you just hinted at was, like, why were these two together? Like, you know, it's not always true, but when we conjoin two pieces, there's usually at least a thematic connection of some kind or an effect that goes from one place to the other. What one character is doing and then how somebody else reacts or is also preparing for same event or some such. So it was really weird. And it was when we got into Padden Fane, I was like, oh, that's why it's the dagger, which is a little confusing. But yeah, I have a few questions, but generally speaking, I liked this, and I think, you know, I haven't always known how I felt about Morgase, but to me, when you have a character kind of knocked back to, like, square one, and their reaction is not to, like, throw a fit, but just like, all right, time to build myself back up, right? I actually remember when Jack Donaghy on 30 Rock got knocked back down to the mailroom and had to work his way back up to CEO. It feels very much like that. Like, you know, how cool to get to see somebody get to rebuild their position in Empire. So it seems fun to me.
Yeah, I actually want to contrast this with Morgase's adopted son, right? A couple of chapters ago, we were talking about how Galad was the worst character until suddenly he was placed in a position that upended everything we knew about him. That is exactly how I feel about Morgase. She is just a boring woman sitting on a boring throne until she's not sitting on that throne anymore. And then that's a really fun, exciting character. I really liked the kind of characterization throughout this chapter of Morgase as being extremely strong-willed and also clearly struggling with compulsion, kind of sapping components of that will from her. The moments where she struggles to not go back to her room, or how long it takes her to actually go to Lini's and realize where she's going, I felt that those felt like really kind of interesting moments by Robert Jordan, giving us both like Morgase as broken and extremely strong kind of simultaneously.
Yeah, I'll co-sign that, and I guess that leads to my main question of the chapter. Is I also really liked this kind of Morgase is waking up from compulsion, right? And you know, it's not exactly the right spell, but I thought about in Harry Potter world when somebody runs out of polyjuice potion, and like they like just can't keep the illusion up, and it's them turning back into themselves. I guess that's primarily in the fourth book, right? Mad-Eye Mooney, but it's not really him. It's the son of it's Barty Crouch. Yeah, it's David Tennant. That's all I really remember here. And so I think that to me is really interesting that we get to rejoin her story at this point. And my main question related to that is we are not given in this chapter the reason why the control is suddenly loose enough that she can escape. But have there been hints at this that I have missed along the way that suggest we do know why she's loosening the grip right now?
Yes, there is a single hint at the very beginning of this book that is very easy to miss. So when we get the Forsaken chapter, I forget if that was in the prologue or in chapter 1, there is a brief discussion about how compulsion is used by different members of the Forsaken. And we learn that some of them, I think Grendel was the example, use compulsion so strongly that it basically breaks the person's mind. And some people, I think it was Gabriel, who was thinking this, don't like to do that. They like to exert kind of a lighter control. And when Gabriel was thinking this, he thought for the vast majority of people, it works perfectly fine. But there are some people who are especially strong-willed, so that if you aren't constantly kind of compulsing them, their will kind of break through and eventually come through and take over again. That seems to be the case for Morgase. So no shame. This was literally like 3 lines of dialogue sometime in chapter 1 of this book, but that's the closest we've got to an explanation for what's going on here.
And so, if I'm understanding you correctly, we read this as just the tipping point in that control. I was kind of wondering, I was thinking back to Brienne and how she was hunting Forsaken and Teleron Riode. I was like, did Gabriel, that's who's controlling Morgase? Did he like trip on a dream ottoman or something, and then so he lost his control or his concentration or something? But I appreciate what you're saying, that it's like, no, it's actually kind of simpler than that. I heard you talking a lot, but all I really heard was mind tricks do not work on me, only money. So yeah, it's somebody who just has that strong will and can break free of those controls, and that actually makes her even more compelling to me. That like you can will your way out of compulsion.
And I thought one thing that was really kind of effective by Robert Jordan is it would have been very easy to make this a story of the queen was under compulsion, and then once once the compulsion is ended, she can kind of reclaim her throne in some way. And Robert Jordan makes villains that are smarter than that, right? Gabriel is not relying on having the ability to control Morgase forever. He has replaced all of her loyalists, and that means that even when she's gone, he still has that kind of base of power. And I think that's just effective plotting by Robert Jordan, right? I think writing smart villains is worth it, and I think this chapter kind of highlights why. I don't have a ton else from the first third to a half of this chapter. Morgase breaking out of the compulsion is interesting. Did you have any other notes about her as a character? Because I feel like you're the one who's experiencing her for the first time.
I mean, I think so much of what it is what you just alluded to, which is like how just kind of mapping out how thoroughly Gabriel has ended her power, right? Like that the allies are gone. And I did like the interplay with her and this other woman saying, like, you know, we all thought it was a little strange because he's like keeping other ladies in the palace and you didn't care and you didn't think about it. And so you know, it feels like in real life when your friend or your buddy is with somebody horrible and then they break up and everybody's suddenly like, oh, we all knew they were terrible. And everybody thinks they're saying something nice. And the person who, you know, got dumped or did the dumping is like, well, that actually, could somebody have spoken up like 3 years ago? Kind of feels like that type of moment where she was acting so out of character, it seems insulting that everybody just assumed she was so deeply in love or what have you. And that is unfortunate, but her reaction to it, again, is not rage, which I really like. It's, oh, okay, well, then I don't have that resource and I don't have that resource. And really, I will say all I knew about her before this is that she was good at playing the board game version of this. And now it seems like we're going to get to see her play the game of games. And that sounds fun, right? I would read a book that was just a queen who lost all her power rising back through the ranks. And yet that's going to be just one strand, it would seem, in this larger puzzle.
This reminded me of a line from Tom, maybe like 5-6 chapters ago. He described Morgase as a woman who could teach Nynaeve manners. And now that we are starting to get a bit from her POV, I can see the kind of single-minded dedication that it would take to teach Nynaeve manners. And it's definitely there for this character. And then we get an even better character. Oh my God, y'all. Lini is just fun to read because she takes no nonsense whatsoever. Obviously, I have deep-seated beloved feelings for the woman that is Lini. You are just meeting her. What are your thoughts about a woman whose quotes we have heard many times before, but we have never seen on screen?
I think she is really fun. And again, I'd compliment Robert Jordan. This feels true to life, right? Like I have a lot of usually older women in my life who've seen it all and have seen young people make a lot of stupid choices. And I wouldn't say the attitude is like over it, but is just kind of like, yep, that's what you did. That's how you got yourself in that hole. It'll be fun to watch you dig out of it. And, you know, my grandmother was kind of like that. It's not like she ever judged the family members who got themselves into trouble. It was much more like, well, yep, you did that. Those were your choices. Good luck to you. And didn't really dwell on it as much as just observe it.
Yeah, that was always, in our family, we had one aunt who that was her job. You would come in and she would just ask you 20 questions and she would never say anything, but you would know what her judgment of you was one way or another. I think everyone has a family member who they think, you know what, Lini reminds me of her or him. I just really love the moment when Morgase is like, you can't talk to me that way. I'm the queen. And Lini's response is, okay, cut off my head. Like, that says everything I need to know about that character and kind of makes me love her immediately, almost as much as I love the image of this probably like 4'8" shriveled old woman just harassing a member of the guard until he comes to this room.
Yeah, and all of that is both endearing in the moment, but also it works so well because it gives you that spark of hope moving forward. Because so much of this is that Morgase is alone. It's like, oh, she's not alone. She's got somebody really savvy, really no nonsense to help her out, and so yeah, if this turns into the kind of buddy cop adventure of taking the world by force with these two, I'm here for it. That seems fun.
I do need to address what I see as the elephant in the room. This sounds like a really fun buddy cop movie in which it seems like at least one of the buddies wants the other two buddies to kiss. How are we feeling about Lini clearly thinking that Morgase needs to stop dismissing Talonvor as too young?
I mean, it's fun. I again, that sounds like my grandmother to me, right? My grandmother assumed if anybody in the family was single, it was not their choice, and they immediately wanted to be in a serious, committed relationship. And she was mostly wrong about that, but was good natured about it enough to push it there. So it seemed of a piece with the character, and I think. To mix that with the moment from your summary where Morgase is kind of remembering her past marriages, I think it's very clear that while these women might have desire, they don't act on their desire nearly as much as they do on their political roles and their machinations.
Yeah. That was the thing that really kind of stood out to me in that list of her kind of former lovers. It was a political marriage, and then the one marriage for love, and then another political marriage, and then compulsion. And that is a rough go if you are Morgase. Basil Gill is back. Did you anticipate this? Were you excited? Did you remember the Queen's blessing? Are you just staring at me now wondering who the hell Basil Gill is? What did the return of a long-lost, probably forgotten character do for you?
I mean, I had remembered that the last time we were in this city that they stayed at a tavern. And so when it said Queen's Blessing, I wasn't like, that has to be it. Like, I just assumed that would be too convenient. And what little I remembered of him, I thought was spoken really well in this chapter, where it was just like, he is more of a Queen's man than anybody you might believe. And that to me kind of rang familiar, and certainly was part of his motivations in helping. At that point, the group was escaping White Cloaks? No, was escaping Dark Friends. He helped him get out of the city.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So he helped him get out of the city, and that is where we lost Tom.
This was just after we had lost Tom. Basil was basically the first friendly face they had seen after losing Tom.
Okay. I think I maybe confused two cities there. But it was exciting, and it works. And again, I like the idea of a world where you can populate a small little tavern and 10 people will pass through it throughout the book series.
If you think we are done passing through the Queen's Blessing, oh, you sweet summer child. I don't think I have anything to say about Lamgwin and, I don't know, Brianna. Let's make it not Brienne, just so it's not the same name twice. I wish this was a cartoon, just so I could see Lamgwin as a giant rectangle, and then Brianna as a little tiny rectangle, right? I'm just imagining two very different shapes. Other than that, they're fun characters. I'm excited to see where we go with them. Any last thoughts on this chapter this part of the chapter before we dive into Pad and Fane?
Well, I think you just said it. When there's a chapter like this, I never quite know if I should look forward to these adventures. Is this going to be a full plot line, or will this be somebody else we're following will eventually run into them? And I hope it's the former. I hope this is really, let's trace them and let's follow this. Obviously, Morgase is an important figure in the world and is kind of importantly tied to so many of our characters. I'm sure this isn't the last we'll see of her, but I'm interested to see if this becomes a promotion, as we often term it.
I have basically no doubt that this will be a promotion after this chapter. When, I think, is the very interesting question, right? Because we've had both Min run away and not come back for a book and a half, and we've also had characters get little intros like this and then immediately continue on with their plot. Pad and Fane, on the other hand, I don't think he's getting his own plot, but there are one or two little juicy details in this section that I think we need to talk about. First off, Fane being kind of between both worlds is really fascinating to me. The way he describes both still having powers that were given to him at Sheol Ghul, and also being so tightly tied to Eredhal, which we would know as Shadar Lagoth, and this dagger that had enslaved Matt for so long. That's just more specifics on how Padan Fain works and what he's kind of made up of than I think we've gotten so far. What were your takes on him as a character before we get into his interactions with the White Tower?
I mean, I think, as I recall, we knew he was headed to the tower. Didn't we get that tip-off last time we saw him?
Yes.
And it's always fun to have him kind of out there as a chaos factor and to know where he'll be going and so on. So I continue to mess up the city they got the dagger in and the city of the final confrontation, right? What are those two names?
Shael Ghul is where the Dark One is sealed. Shadar Lagath is the city of shadow where Matt got the dagger.
So basically, whenever they say one of those, I probably think it's the opposite. I think I always go to the one where they got the dagger.
It's me with REM and Radiohead. They're the two R bands that I don't know which one is which.
Oh, fair enough. So those parts are a little bit of a struggle for me, but I do like Padan Fain. I think I'm greatly influenced by how great his characterization was on the show. So I think like my engagement of that character is I can picture that actor now, and it's really fun to me.
The other part of this chapter that is then really interesting is Padan Fain runs into a character who we have seen several times, and we had suspicions that she was not the greatest because she helped Elayne overthrow Siwan, but Black Aja is maybe not what I had expected for Elviarin, and having the number 2 in the White Tower be Black Aja is, that's not a great look.
Yeah, so I wrote in my notes this just to confirm. This was a revelation that she was Black Aja, and I thought it was also very important. It seemed like this was a classic Wikipedia disambiguation thread where it's like, just so we're clear, it was not the Black Aja that took over. They added to the instability so that the tower is not controlled directly by the Black Aja, although Alviarin makes it very clear that she's very happy where she is and feels like she's in control, and the Black Aja wield the power.
Yeah, so it's worth noting the last time that we were with the Supergirls, with Nynaeve and Elayne, they had heard from someone that basically, or I think it was maybe even one of Egwene's dreams, but the kind of hint they had gotten is that the Black Aja controlled the tower, but they were not in charge of it. And Elviarin, the last time we were with Elayne, was like running councils without Elayne's knowledge. So I think that perfectly fits. Where they have a cover, they are not technically in charge, but anything they want to change, they have someone who's in all of the meetings and can make it happen.
I've been on plenty of campuses to know that that's how power works, right? I mean, it's not the president of a university, while involved in the day-to-day, is often not where the real power to get stuff done at a university happens. There's usually number 2 or somebody
provost of something.
Yep, who's in all the meetings and you know, is the one who will actually come after you and get you to do your job or what have you. So that feels very true to life. And you know, I want to be clear, universities are my experience. I'm sure people would say this about most businesses and workplaces that they work.
But mostly universities. They are wretched hives of scum and villainy. Chapter 20, Jangai Pass. Rand looks out at the spine of the world. He sees a number of things. First, he wonders why anyone would ever want to climb mountains. Then he sees a number of ruins that he thinks are probably from the Age of Legends. And then he sees a number of shipwrecks that he thinks were probably accumulated there when this was the bottom of the ocean, and the breaking of the world has since made it a mountain. We realize that he is listening to Moraine tell him about the Carrienin, but he is mostly ignoring her. Rand thinks of all of the things that Moraine has been telling him, including to trust no Aes Sedai except for her, Egwene, and Nynaeve, and he thinks about the fact that he is trying to learn everything he can, but there is so much she wants to squeeze into such a short period of time. He sees a town ahead, and at this point Moraine says she has little time left to teach him and tries to get his attention back, but he insists there is plenty of time, and she accedes. At this point he sees a number of bodies that have been tied up and placed around the village by Couladin, and he remembers something from the past and then shouts in his head that he is Rand al'Thor and not Lews Therin. He thinks if he dies at Shayol Ghul, he at least will do everything he can to die at Shayol Ghul as himself and not someone else. Lan then notes there are a group of people hiding nearby and says they must not be Aiel because he saw them. He notes a number of changes Rand notes a number of changes in Egwene and Hednan Kader since they crossed the Dragon Wall, and then he sees a small, rugged group of people approaching, and they seem thrilled that he is not Aiel. Matt asks them about sentries because they were attacked in the night, apparently, and they say they set none. They are very angry about all Aiel, and I wrote down they're a little bit racist at this point. A woman says Aiel took a number of people in addition to their goods and other things, and one of the men says that he had markings on his arm similar to those on Rand's arm. Rand says that he got them as a gift in the desert, and they say that it has been 6 days since Couladin and the Shido came through, and note that there are about 100 survivors. And they say that the bodies were left out as a message for what Couladin called the one who will come after, Rand. The group then panic when they see a number of Aiel who arrive with Rand. The Aiel gather behind him, and at this point we get a brief history of the sapling that the Aiel gave to the Carrienin, and how they now have a rivalry, mostly from the Aiel side, because the Carrienin cut it down, causing the Aiel War. At this point, Rand asks that Lan and some of the Aiel gather up all of the people who have fled and give them food and shelter, and then also starts to make plans for what to do next. He asks whether or not the other Aiel support Couladin's actions, and they say he has abandoned Giato, and they seem to see this as kind of the greatest ill that he could possibly commit. They camp near the village and send out scouts to find any Shido traps, and the maidens seem upset when Rand sends one of the other groups rather than the maidens to do the scouting. He tells Ruark to feed the survivors and to bury the dead, and they will head out after Couladin shortly. This one was a shorter chapter. I don't have nearly as much to say about it. Are you amped that we are back across the Dragon Wall in contradiction of your predictions?
Yay. There are a few things here that stood out to me, and I'll probably make a bunch of pop culture references that barely make sense. So what was most striking to me about this chapter is I thought this started to have the Star Wars problem that Star Wars gained after the prequels, where when you watch the original trilogy, it's like, man, this empire is oppressive and everything's been terrible for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then you watch the prequels and you're like, oh, so it was less than 20 years of bad times. And like this felt a little like that, where it's like, oh, it's felt like the Aiel War was like a really long time ago, and it's like, oh no, like they're all still alive. It was like 20 years ago. Like it's all fine. Yeah. I mean, it's almost exactly the Star Wars structure, because that conflict led to Rand being found, and then Rand is now in adulthood, just like Luke is, and so on. So the parallel is there, but it does have that feeling where, sometimes when you learn about that ancient history, you're like, oh no, it was like 20 years, and that's not so bad. So
That's the odd thing about the image at the beginning of this chapter, right? We are getting details about stuff that is 20 years ago and 2,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, and they're in the wrong order on the mountain. And I feel like that is just Wheel of Time all over, right? Like, time is a little bit jumbled. Nothing completely makes sense. The things that feel like deep history are actually really recent. The Aes Sedai somehow were around for stuff like 150 years ago. Like, weird things go on with time in this book. And I think you're correctly identifying it really does kind of mess with you in this chapter, right? There's a lot of playing around with history and when and where, right? Even down to the fact that in this chapter, the village has no guards, despite the fact that they are the first village across the Dragon Wall, I think tells you how much this culture has moved on even from that thing that you're describing. You're right, is so recent, it feels like it shouldn't have been forgotten.
Well, and that does feel so. A lot of Star Wars fans were angry when like the sequel trilogy started, and they were like, all that, and they only got 20 years in that case too. That's the other end of the Star Wars timeline. And one of my responses was like, well, if we won World War I and World War II happened,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not like we regretted winning World War I, even though in that there's a very clear causal link, and I think you can make that case. So it feels like
Yeah.
a little bit of that here too. Like, yeah, each generation has to, kind of solve the conflict that it was fighting, but it doesn't mean just because peace doesn't last forever that it's a bad thing. But I don't want to lose sight of what you said, which is the mountain is really cool, and the idea that you have all these layers kind of exposed, and then this idea of the creatures that are visible, like that all really worked for me to make us think about a world that is so fully realized that he's thought about those things even in passing.
And I love as you're describing that kind of like how important time is, you describe it as generations learning from what came before. This is a chapter where Rand misses learning from the woman who was literally there when he was born during the Aiel War, right? He is just, Moraine, we have time, get over it. And more than anything else, I just felt like that tick, tick, tick. Every time Moraine says we're running out of time, I wonder just how little time there is left.
Well, and that hints at my second annoying pop culture reference. I was trying to think what I was thinking about, but what came to mind was Job in Arrested Development. There's a long period of time where Job thinks he's Steve Holt's father, and so Steve Holt will say something remotely related to father, and Job will just stare into the middle distance, and he plays a song and thinks about it. And that's where Moraine is for me right now. Like, Rand's like, "Shut up, Moraine. We've got all the time in the world," and Moraine's like, "Yes, we do have all the time. Why would I be in a rush?" And just like stares into the middle distance. And I'm like, all right, like the hints that Moraine firmly believes she's not long for this. And the ambiguity to me is still she's not long to remain with Rand or she's going to die. That seems clear. She believes one of those two things is imminent. And so she's rushing. Very Alexander Hamilton, just talking and talking and talking to get all the information down before she dies.
Hey, Greg, I can't say a damn thing about that. Instead, I think that we should probably talk about Rand going crazy, because we have our second instance of Rand hearing a voice in his head giving him information that he should not have. This is the first time he responds to it internally. He kind of shouts back, like, "I am Randall Thor. I am not, Luz Theron," or something along those lines. But A, the fact that he's still hearing it and it's getting more persistent is notable. And B, the fact that he's responding to it, I think tells us something about where he's at and how this is progressing. What are you feeling about kind of Rand, the narrator with a narrator in his head?
I think it's more effective when we're in his head at realizing how his slip on reality is changing. And, what came to mind is like, oh, I've sat near this guy on the subway, right? Who's just like sitting alone and maybe mumbling a little, but then all of a sudden just shouts something. And,
I've maybe
calmly
been this guy on the subway.
You calmly and patiently just try to like move to the other section of the car, and you put a little distance there. And why I think it's more effective when we're in his head is you get to picture that, and I like feeling like he's acting rationally, right? Like there is that feeling to it when you see that, but you recognize that everybody around him could easily think he's losing his grip on reality, because hey, he's probably losing his grip on reality.
And I think that the word you use there that's exactly right is the word rational, right? Rand is not in any way losing his rationality. He's just losing his grip on which facts he should rationally analyze. And that's almost worse, right? It's not that he's crazy and making up absurd leaps. It's just that he thinks a couple of things are real that maybe aren't.
Well, and I keep also linking into another classic pop culture crazy person move is like getting obsessed with prophecies and books and trying to predict what's going to happen. And so there's always that valence to his actions too, that he's reacting to things and he's rationally responding to the voice in his head, though the voice is not rational. And then he also is so interested in interpreting every single event in this kind of map of all the and like all of that is like, yeah, I would go crazy too, trying to balance those all out in my head at a given moment.
I'm not sure whether you are an It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fan or not, but as soon as you were describing that, all I could think of is Rand doing the Pepe Sylvia meme when he's in the mailroom. Given your face, I don't think that is a reference you are understanding at
that's
all.
a hole in mine. That's a hole in mine. But I did just do a solid 20 minutes on Arrested Development, so.
I only had two other kind of quick moments in this chapter. The first is we get this kind of quick recap of the Aiel and the Carrienin, this idea that the Aiel view them as tree killers, and I loved the moment when Rand kind of has to remind the Aiel none of these people broke any oaths, and I thought that was kind of really telling of how kind of long the Aiel's memory is and how willing they are to take one man's sins and kind of put it on an entire culture.
So I recently took my dad on a trip to Disney World with my son. It was amazing. And when we were in Orlando, which listeners will know is very far away from New Hampshire, I asked my dad if we could go to Applebee's one night for dinner because it's good for kids. And he told me no, because he'd one time been to an Applebee's in New Hampshire where he got seated at a table and no waitress ever came over. So after 15 minutes, he got up and left. And so he would not be going to the Applebee's in metropolitan Orlando. And I wish at the time I had said to my dad, these people broke no oath to you. They will bring us menus and appetizers. I swear to you. You know, I'm of a culture that is very much in line with the Aiel.
Yeah, I have never related to something quite in that way, but yes, you should feel a deep and abiding relationship with the Aiel after that. I think you are correct. The other moment that I thought was really telling about the Aiel in this chapter is the Aiel are faced with a massacre in which all the bodies are piled everywhere, and their response to it is, he went a little too far. It's horrible he gave up Giotto. Right? They see the loss of honor as the true crime there. And I think that really is telling of where the Aiel are going to be placed as they now enter the other side of the world, right? They are very honorable. They will not kill more than is necessary, but they don't seem to have any real moral compunctions about killing people on this side of the mountains. They just don't want to do it too often, too fast.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bury the lead of Kaladin, still a dick. And I think that's where I landed as a reader, but I liked that is not, as you're saying, that's not where the Aiel were. The Aiel were like, he was a little strong. He was a little harsh, right? And he should have been a little more generous here. But I accept what you're saying. This sounds a little bit like the Vulcans or something, like kind of coldly rational. Like, yes, they deserve to suffer, but they should not have suffered this 10% too much.
Yeah, exactly, right? That kind of cold calculation, I think, tells us a lot about, I don't know whether Rand was not worried about the consequences of bringing the Aiel over the wall. Everyone else was, and after this encounter, I am now a little bit more than I was before. Did you have any other thoughts on this chapter? I kind of jumped to my key points, but there's a lot of stuff that I skipped over that I think you could have maybe drawn something out of. Any other thoughts on Jangai Pass?
No, well, I did just call Kaladin a dick, but in my notes it was Kaladin being an a-hole. So I guess I changed my mind. But I really didn't have a lot here. I thought it was more of a catch up with these characters, kind of have some fun with the timeline. The timeline stuff seems a piece with how the television show has, from that like opening shot, kind of played a little more deeply in it. So I'm interested to get a little more of that puzzle filled in. I always assume when that comes up, there are things I know and things I know I don't know, and then things I don't know that I don't know. And I'm always wondering what a few more of those pieces are.
Those are very good questions, Mr. Rumsfeld. I'll be happy to get into them next time. We have lots of opportunity to see what comes next because in the following week, we are going to be talking about 3 chapters rather than our usual 2. We will be covering Chapter 21, The Gift of a Blade, Chapter 22, Bird Calls by Night, and Chapter 23, The Fifth I Give You. And as Greg said before we started, those are some weird names for chapters. What do you think is upcoming when you read those? And then, if you would like to, you can say the name of our podcast.
I really don't know. I thought those were very, very strange names. The Gift of the Blade makes me most excited of it. And I remember that there's some culture with the fifth being some percentage of the spoils of war. I think that was Aiel. So I assume that's what we're related to that. So I'm excited. Again, I think listeners have now heard that we had some technical issues. So we were kind of stuck in the mud for a week. And so I felt like we were kind of stuck. And now both the momentum of the book is picking up and then the momentum of our podcast continues apace. So that makes me very happy. And I hope everybody will join us next time through memory, all alone in the moonlight. We almost got through it, through the glass columns.
I hate you so much. Yeah. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.